you see the studio?
It's never been an issue. Delighted to have you all here today. We find ourselves in the midst of a global economic maelstrom. Traditional financial lenders that we trusted, people such as Merrill Lynch, Lehman Brothers, and Citigroup, weren't worthy of our trust. Journalists have had to sue the government to try to find out what sort of deals had been made with the $700 billion in bailout money that we taxpayers are responsible for. At the same time, journalism itself is undergoing a massive overhaul and brutal downsizing. All of this comes together to make business journalism in the 21st century especially important. Never have all of us seen the impact of money on the lives of individuals and on families so pronounced, and never have we seen Americans give more rapt attention to what's going on in the economic and financial markets. The need to accurately and aggressively cover the financial dealings of business and government is more urgent than ever before. Because of new technologies, the presentation and the mediums will be different and will be ever evolving. But the importance of finding the truth, explaining how companies and investments work, rooting out wrongdoers, and putting the results into stories that average people can understand will never change. And that's why we're here today, to bring the past, the present, and the future of business journalism together. It was 37 years ago that Don Barlett and Jim Steele were paired together on an investigative story at the Philadelphia Inquirer. It was about abuses in a federal housing administration program. Well, since then, the team worked out pretty well. The team has won almost every major journalism award, including 2 Pulitzer Prizes and 2 National Magazine's awards. They are the gold standard by which all other investigative journalism is judged. They currently write for Vanity Fair magazine, so we're delighted to have Don and Jim with us today. Really pleased. When we first named these awards, I first went to Jim and Don, and Jim, his point that he made to me was, we're really honored to have awards like this named for us. There's just one thing we'd like you to always get across since they're being named for us. It is, we're not dead. So we present them to you today as verification of their being alive, and also alive and kicking because they are writing some really outstanding investigative pieces for Vanity Fair magazine as well these days. We're delighted to have them here. We also have with us recipients of the 2nd Annual Reynolds Center Barlett and Steele Awards for Investigative Business Journalism. Brian Groh is a senior writer at BusinessWeek, where he works on the Special Projects team. He co-authored Prisoners of Debt. That's this year's first place award winner, which will receive this trophy. The stories explain how large financial firms collaborate with doctors and hospitals to turn unpaid medical bills into high-interest consumer debt, and also how banks and credit card firms badger unsophisticated consumers to pay off debts even after they have been extinguished by the bankruptcy courts. We're also pleased to have in our audience Robert Berner of BusinessWeek, who is also a writer on Prisoners of Debt. Robert, would you stand up? We're really delighted to have both of them here, and they're part of the team that did some outstanding work. Not only that, the latest edition of BusinessWeek has an outstanding article cover story by Robert as well. David Heath is an investigative reporter at the Seattle Times and co-author with Hal Burnton of this year's runner-up award. The 4-part series, The Favor Factory, through exhaustive research, uncovered thousands of purchases that the U.S. Congress has forced the military to make in recent years, and that includes a $4.5 million Navy vessel that sits unused by a Seattle pier. They also built a database that directly linked the waste to political contributions. Business journalism in the 21st century already is and will continue to be a multimedia discipline. Investigative journalism especially lends itself to this because of the amount of varied material that needs to be presented. Anita Malik is Deputy Director of the Reynolds Center. Besides her management responsibilities and oversight of our businessjournalism.org website, she is a frequent presenter at workshops on effective use of multimedia to tell stories. She was also publisher and founding editor of East West, a lifestyle magazine targeting Asian Americans. We're also really pleased to have with us today the leaders of the Donald W. Reynolds Foundation in Las Vegas, whose vision and generosity have made the Reynolds Center at the Cronkite School possible. And I'm going to say their names, and I'd like to ask them to stand as I say them. We have Foundation Chairman Fred Smith. We have President Steve Anderson. We have Trustee Wes Smith. And way in the back, we have Journalism Program Consultant Bill Winter. All of them have played a tremendous role in what has happened. It is one thing to complain about business coverage. It's quite another thing, as the Reynolds Foundation has done, to actually do something to improve its quality through generosity and guidance. So we greatly applaud and appreciate them for the great things they've done with us. Now let's get to our panel. Brian Grow, in reading your series, I was, Brian, okay, over here. You may now resume your places. Brian Grow wrote a great series that was about, Brian, one of the things that was so fascinating about your series, and we had a very august panel that went over all these different entries, was so many different forms of debt. I thought I understood how debt worked in this country, and I was just amazed at the sort of things that were uncovered in this series. How did you start this series in coming up with what you were going to go after first and next?
Well, in fact, earlier we were talking with Jim and Don and trying to explain why they 30 years ago and us today are still writing about debt-related issues. And it seems to me like the saying is the only two things that are sure in life are death and taxes. Well, actually, before that, it's life and debt. And we were looking at the broader impact of the subprime market and asking ourselves, why does it seem like so many low-income consumers are being sold high-priced goods and services that they actually should be the ones who shouldn't have to pay that? To answer your question about how we got to these two topics, part of that first set of research was sitting down with lower-income consumers to look at their credit reports and their bills. And in the course of doing that, we actually found medical debts that were being billed to them by firms that we had never heard of. And so in Fresh Pain for the Uninsured, we started asking, who are these companies that are financing these medical bills, and what's the system in place that enables that to happen? In the bankruptcy debt story, we heard from lawyers that we were talking to in the course of our research who said you really need to look at how Chapter 7 bankruptcy debt that's been discharged by the courts is being traded in a secondary market. That very idea doesn't seem to make sense. It doesn't seem like that should be possible if it's been canceled. But dig behind the scenes, and what we found is there are loopholes in the law that allow it to be kept alive on the credit report, and ultimately, in many cases, the consumer is forced to pay it off. But since then, we've done other reports in the area of debt, and this week's cover, in fact, I wanted to show was written by Robert. It's called The Subprime Wolves, and it's about how former subprime lenders are reinventing themselves amid the panic to become FHA lenders and using some of the same lending tactics that caused the crisis, but now the taxpayer's on the hook if the loan goes bad.
What was the toughest part of working on that series? Where did you get the most resistance?
Well, just like we're seeing right now in the cause of the crisis and now in the bailout, the biggest problem is the opacity of the information, the lack of a willingness to share data. And the same thing applied in our series. It's very difficult to even understand your own credit report, let alone take the information on it and try to, track it back to the particular company and then ask that company, why have you Capital One continued to list these individuals' credit card debts, which were canceled 3 years ago by a bankruptcy court, as active? And to get a straight answer. I mean, in one example, we asked them about a debtor who ended up paying a $9,000 bill that had been canceled by a court when they were trying to get a new loan, new mortgage loan, and they said that it was an administrative error. But lo and behold, 5 months after our story was published, they paid $10 million to the Office of the U.S. Trustee, part of the Justice Department, which had found that they had done that on thousands of accounts. So it seems a little bit more than an administrative error.
It's amazing how little we knew about debt. And if you use the example of Merrill Lynch and Bear Stearns, until their CEOs acknowledged the amount of subprime debt and how bad the subprime debt was, nobody even working at the companies, many of the people had no idea. I'm sure the partners, as we know, the partners at Bear Stearns and many of these other firms were just as disgruntled as the public was. David, government boondoggle spawned by Congress. It was amazing in looking over the series, and the judges noted the sorts of things that go on that are actually in front of our faces that we don't really realize where it came from. Tell us a little bit about what spawned your series and some of the background.
Well, at the time there were a series of scandals in Congress that you probably all know about. Jack Abramoff, a lobbyist who was doing crazy things and getting earmarks, and Duke Cunningham, who was a congressman from San Diego, accepted $2.5 million in bribes in exchange for earmarks. And in my own neck of the woods in Seattle, we had a scandal involving the Boeing company. In fact, one of the executives at Boeing ended up going to prison. And I wanted to take a look at whether or not these scandals were part of something that was really bigger that was going on in Congress, whether or not there was really something going on with this earmarking that was not right. And I started with a very simple question that I just wanted to know basically what were members of Congress getting for these earmarks, or what was the payoff? And I wanted to take a look at the relationship between campaign donations and earmarks to see if members of Congress were getting big campaign donations from those who were getting earmarks. It turned out that question I was a little naive about it. I thought that I was going to start off and just go get the list of earmarks, that somebody in Congress is going to hand me this list of earmarks, and then I could just match it up, and it was going to be a fairly straightforward thing. It turns out that earmarks were pretty much hidden, that they're really secret, and it took me a long time just to identify what the earmarks were, and to identify who was giving them, and to identify who was getting them, and then I did match them up with campaign donations. And as you mentioned, I found cases where earmarks that made absolutely no sense were going to companies that were giving pretty sizable campaign donations to members of Congress.
Tell us about that ship.
Yeah, so one of them was, and remember, what I did ultimately was I created a database out of press releases. So earmarking had become so out of control that members of Congress are now actually bragging about it. So they would issue press releases saying, hey, look what I brought back, from my district. And so I was able to take all these. I went to every single member of Congress and got in their website and got all the press releases related to the Defense Appropriations Bill and compiled them. And then I was just looking for things that I understood: boats, T-shirts, computer monitors, things that I understood. A lot of these earmarks were about things I couldn't make sense of. And we found one was a boat that members of the local delegation kept giving earmarks to this local company. It was a company of 3 people. They invented this boat. It's an 85-foot boat. It goes really fast. And they originally intended to sell it to foreign governments, but no one wanted to buy it. They sold for $4.5 million. So what happened was the guy who ran the company was a college friend of one of the congressmen in the Seattle area, and he went to this person and started giving campaign donations, big ones, to members of Congress. And over the course of the next 3 or 4 years, he ended up getting 4 earmarks, selling 4 boats to both the U.S. Navy and the Coast Guard. And at the time, both the Navy and the Coast Guard made it clear that they didn't want the boats. So the Coast Guard, in their case, they actually took the boat and gave it to a sheriff. They gave it away. They looked at it for a little bit, and then they gave it to a sheriff's office in San Francisco. And then another one, the Navy had taken, before the boat was even launched, before it was even finished, they decided to give it to the University of Washington, who turns out didn't want it either. So the University of Washington actually, because they had gotten involved in handling the contract on this case, they ended up having to store the boat for 2 or 3 years. and they would take it out once a year to kind of keep the engine warm or clean, or to keep the pipes running or whatever. But they ended up, just before our series came out, and when I called the Navy couldn't even find the boat. They couldn't even find, and I was saying, it's just right outside my office. It's like, it was right in downtown Seattle, like parked at the University of Washington.
That was the most amazing part of the story. The boat that was built basically because of contributions and earmarks, and nobody wanted it.
Right, no one wanted it.
A boat for no one. It was interesting that Jim and Don's career started with coverage of housing and government and the interlocking of those two areas. Don and Jim, how has investigative business journalism changed since those days when you were first becoming what would become investigative business journalists? How's it changed?
Well, maybe to put this in a little more historical perspective, because I can go back further than anyone. Go back to the 50s, it didn't exist. 60s barely existed. I think you can probably date one of the very first big stories to the Wall Street Journal, the great salad oil swindle of Tino DeAngelis, which is really remarkably similar to today's collateralized mortgage scandal. Very, very similar. In those days, it was a lot simpler. Mr. DeAngelis was selling futures and trying to corner the salad oil market with all of these giant warehouse full of salad oil, except the containers contained water rather than salad oil. And which is very similar to today's collateralized mortgage scandal, that there's nothing there. So in some ways it hasn't changed, but what has changed in the 50s, the 60s, and even into the 70s, when Jim and I first teamed up, there was very little business investigative reporting. The attitude generally of most newspapers was to stay away from it. You know, the reasons are many. But that was pretty much the attitude. They didn't touch anything that involved business. There were exceptions. You could investigate corrupt labor in business. That was okay. But not corrupt business practices. That wasn't okay. So in an area in which people tend to pat themselves on the back, when this whole process started, there weren't many reasons to do it. The business really, newspapers and magazines, did very little of this work. And when we did, I can tell you how it was alluded to, our first project was an FHA scandal. Again, very similar to what Brian's doing and his people are doing today, 40 years later. But basically what it was FHA insured mortgages being peddled to poor people buying houses who were guaranteed FHA insured mortgages at hugely inflated prices. Real estate speculators would buy a property for $8,000, paint it, and sell it for $30,000 and get an FHA insured mortgage. And this was unlike any of the series we do today, and it didn't run one part after another. We wrote one story, a week would go by, we'd write another, and it was stretched out over time. And one day a call came in, and I'll never forget this. It's just a happenstance who gets these calls. Sometimes Jim, sometimes I would. But it was from a real estate broker who said, "I guess you won't be writing about us anymore." And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "We've pulled all of our advertising from the Enquirer until this stops." Now I'm coming at this from a little different perspective, having worked in Cleveland and Chicago, where such even a threat would have ended the series. So I thought, here we go again. So I go down to the office of the editor who hired Jim and I, this crusty old Miami Herald editor who was brought in to run the Philadelphia Enquirer, and I said, "What's this phone call?" I'll never forget this because it was like, I said, "I found the Holy Grail." He said, "You two write, I'll handle everything else." And that was it. And this was at a time when the Philadelphia Enquirer was marginally profitable, and I mean marginally 6 figures. Cancellation of the real estate advertising would put it into the red. That paper never wavered. And for the full year, they just said, keep turning them out. And that's really what separates what's happening today. There are more and more Philadelphia Inquirers out there, and like that David works for, the Seattle Times, and BusinessWeek, which has done phenomenal work, which no other business publication is doing at their level. None. And so that's probably the biggest change.
Jim, what do you see as what's really different?
Kind of add to what Don's saying, the biggest difference is really the sophistication of the business journalism today versus even 30 years ago, 35, 40 years ago. I mean, the idea of the pieces that you have done and the honorable mentions in this contest have done, absolutely inconceivable a number of years ago. So there's been a wonderful development in the craft where people are looking deeply into issues. They're able to crunch numbers. They're able to look beyond just the kinds of things that people hand them. One thing that, at the risk of showing you how old we are, one of the things that's so wonderful about this time, for all the problems that are out there and for all of the questions about the business and where it's going to go, there is an ability to access information today that is absolutely breathtaking. And this is something that can't be emphasized too much. When Don and I first started working together, if you simply wanted to look at the annual report of a public company back in the early 70s, well, you might write them, and they might send it to you, or they probably wouldn't send it to you. Or if you had a big university library in your town, they might have it, but they probably didn't have it. If you lived in Washington, you could go down to the Securities and Exchange Commission and get a copy. But most of us aren't living in Washington at any particular time in our life. In the 70s, this was changed by a company called Disclosure, Inc., which began making these copies available for about 30 cents a page. Some of the same kinds of things were found in libraries. So you can go in and look at 10Ks and all the various other SEC filings, proxies, so on and down the line. Now, of course, jump to today, 24/7 on any of us who have internet access can look at any of this information for free. That is a huge quantum leap in terms of access to information. And that same story is repeated all down the line in terms of regulatory agencies at both the state and the federal level. Bankruptcy courts today. Bankruptcy court remains a huge reservoir of information about businesses and how they run. All of those things in the past, you had to go to the bankruptcy court and get your files. Today, again, 24/7, you can go online and through Pacer download and review a whole voluminous amount of information. These are absolutely tidal shifts. So for all the other difficulties that we may have in this world, this is an access ability that just was not there many, many years ago. And we, to this day, benefit from that every day we work.
Anita, you've seen these entries, and you and I judged an organization's multimedia presentations. What new things are we seeing in Investigative series that we didn't see before, and where might this lead to? What are some of the advantages that multimedia offers for presenting investigative work?
Well, I think it's interesting. I think it's an ironic situation in a way. I mean, Jim and Don innovated really computer-assisted reporting, and so I think a lot of reporters are comfortable, and like you just said, using the internet to now use as a source to get your information, to collect and produce your story. Not as many are as comfortable as using it as a medium to tell the story. But what's been happening with investigations, and I think it's interesting to see, is that teams, no matter if they're not as long-standing as Jim and Don, create these in-depth pieces. In the case of BusinessWeek with Robert and Brian, and then David and Hal, it's a teamwork going on. And that is exactly what happens with multimedia, is you need to develop cross-functional teams. And so we need to see journalists creating those cross-functional teams and implementing that into their newsroom and saying, how are we going to present this online now? How are we going to make it show this, tell the story in video? Maybe we're going to do an interactive timeline. There's a lot of different components that you're starting to see. And I think with the Favorite Factory, you actually had a special landing page for this. And I think that's an interesting discussion point, is how did you do it within your newsroom? Was it a cross-functional team? Were you involved in that process as a reporter?
That was a big deal. So what we had to do was we had to create this database. So we have this database on our website that has, so as I mentioned, we went out and got all these press releases and we converted those into a database, which was an undertaking all of its own because basically we got a couple of interns to help, but it was quite a lot of work. And then we wanted to marry that data to Federal Election Commission data, so the campaign contribution data, which was quite an ordeal as well. And then also marry that to lobbying data, which at that time, lobbying data today, as Jim and Don alluded to, like it used to be that lobbying data, you'd go up and you could get these fuzzy images that they put up, even like just two years ago. It was like these fuzzy images that were hard to read on the internet. You could like print them off and read them page at a time and things like that. And that's really what we were dealing with just when we were doing our series. And we hand inputted all this information. So we went and got the names of everybody who'd given gotten an earmark that we were able to identify, and we got all their lobbying reports and we entered them into these databases by hand. Now today, I redid the database this year. Today it's all electronic, so things have really changed in that way. But getting back to your question, so we had to create this quite extraordinary database that married all these different data sets together, and it required customized, web production. We had an engineer from the web team that basically became part of the team, and had to build a customized database that you couldn't just throw up. I mean, it was quite an undertaking. And so we'd have meetings where, so you'd have, web producers and engineers, and it wasn't just like a reporter and an editor working on a story anymore. It's completely different today.
Brian, when your series, what ignited it all? I mean, how did you pull things together? We're talking about this cooperation in the newsroom. And as we know, historically, cooperation in newsrooms has not been great. There have been large walls between everybody. Reporters who said, I don't do photos, and I don't like any headline I've ever seen. And we've heard that many times. What kind of cooperation went into your series, and how were these other aspects of it considered?
Well, we have a team of about 5 people dedicated to investigations, Robert, myself, and 3 others. And, at the beginning, I think you have to ask, do you have the same instincts? And we all have the same instincts. So on Prisoners of Debt, for example, we had both been reporting on separate topics when we both got referrals to take a look at how bankruptcy debt was being kept alive. And when we talked to each other, we were both like, this is counterintuitive. We have to dig deeper. And when we work together, I like to say that Robert is an ultra marathoner of journalism. He has incredible stamina and will report deep and around the clock. Whereas I might conceptualize, how would one explain the concept of a canceled bankruptcy debt being kept alive? That's inherently boring. So how would we present that to the reader, and how would we structure a story that would be compelling enough that you'd want to sit down and read it and might consider it for an award? So that's where we, I think, complement each other. The same thing applied to Fresh Pain for the Uninsured, which was basically a story of how the millions of uninsured are being offered new loans to pay for their medical debt, which on its face seems all right. But if you dig a little bit deeper, you understand that the uninsured don't get the discounts that you and I get when we have insurance, which can amount to as much as 50% or more of the full hospital cost. So if you are being billed at the full price and then you're adding 10, 15, 19% interest on top of it, then that uninsured person who's more likely to be low income is probably being dug deeper into a hole. And there, it was the same story. We fanned out across the country contacting patient advocacy groups and basically saying, here's a set of 10 firms who are specialists in medical finance. Do you have any patients who might have gotten loans from them? And then we used prior reporting where we looked at low-income consumers' credit reports, and we did the same sort of cross-referencing. But as far as interactive and multimedia, I tell you, it was very hard to come up with a compelling interactive or video option for bankruptcy debt. So there we didn't really try to go down that path. But at the beginning of every project, we actually try to assess what are our multimedia channel options. So there's the core story, there's the online extras as we call them, then there's the video opportunity, and then our favorite multimedia element is the narrated slideshow, which, you know, from our standpoint is a time-consuming effort, but actually is very popular. A story I did earlier this year that looked at counterfeit military microchips that were being produced from our own electronic waste, our old computers, that's shipped to China and then sold back into the military supply chain in the U.S., actually had a great example of the multimedia opportunity where we identified some markets where they were remarking the microchips as military grade and new, even though they were old and from your cell phone. And when I sent the reporter to this market in this rural town, I said, take a video camera with you. And so he did, and what he got was people with the motherboard from your PC over an open fire, heating up the solders and then pulling them off with pliers and then sanding them on a piece of wood with sandpaper tacked on top. Now, when we ran that with the story, it was the most popular element of the package because it was like, are you kidding me? And that's going into an F-15 here in the U.S.? Yeah, we followed the trail.
That's an interesting point. When you say, are you kidding me? One of the directives that Jim gave us with the Barlett and Steele Awards was their credo is, tell me something I don't know. Don't tell me now how much worse this is or that. Tell me something that's going to make me say, are you kidding me? Could that possibly be happening? Well, currently there's a lot of reduced staffing, a lot of changes going on in newsrooms. What does this portend for investigative business journalism, and what words of encouragement or directive might you give the journalist who has to take this into account going forward? Don and Jim.
Anyway, I don't think any of us know exactly how everything is going to ultimately shake out in the business. But obviously, many new outlets are coming up, online possibilities, and even the existing conventional journalism, newspapers, magazines, there's still a tremendous amount of this reporting going on. I mean, look at what we have here today with the two projects that are honored here, as well as the honorable mentions. All 5 of these projects, if you look at them, and they're all available through the web page. I mean, you can see every one of these. They all illustrate tremendous depth of research and sweat equity to try to get out of them this tremendous story. So there always, I think there are always going to be these opportunities. Exactly what directions are going to go in the future, I don't think any of us knows. But even in the state of journalism today, the most amazing thing about business journalism, it's still better right now by a long shot in terms of the quality, the depth, and what people are getting at than what you saw 30, 35 years ago. So we still have a pretty good level of work going on, but I don't think any of us know exactly what all the mediums are going to be 5 and 10 years from now. I'm convinced, Don and I have talked about this, we talk about it endlessly because we're all curious about this. You know, what will ultimately happen? Will it be partial paper? Will it be online through your computer, your television? Will we have one of these marvelous little handheld tablets like IREX has come up with now, I guess in the Netherlands, that's 8 by 11, like a sheet of paper and just a little thicker than that, where you can read magazines, books, as well as parts of newspapers? Will that be the portable device that frees people from sitting in front of a computer screen that gives us the portability we now have with paper, whatever it is? I don't think any of us fully know that, but what we do know is the need for this is absolutely pivotal, and it's absolutely crucial. It's just like the wonderful speech we heard this morning from the president of the university about journalism, why it is so important, why it needs to be preserved for democracy. So somehow this will work itself out. But for a million years, I couldn't sit here and tell you exactly how that'll shape up.
One thing we found is that, first of all, the entries, all levels of publications or online sites, really good work can be done by someone who gets it in their head that this is important. And I think in terms of students or young reporters, anything you think that seems kind of fishy, there's a good chance it is. And in business, the opportunity is a lot of people don't understand it well enough to do good stories about it. And the key is, of all these mediums we talk about, the good entries, the ones that matter, are the ones that tell a story. They have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and somewhere to go with it. They're not just a lot of stuff. When Nita and I looked at multimedia entries, some of them have pull downs and bop overs and this and that. Great. And if they tell the story, they're great and they really help. But if they're just stuff, it really doesn't help at all. Another thing is students or young reporters will say, well, I don't have the time to put on an investigative story. I don't have the time. And I always say, do you think that Don and Jim were simply told, you're bright young fellas, why don't you take about 9 months here and work on this story? It doesn't happen that way. And most of the investigative reporters I've run into that do a good job do a lot of that legwork on their own time. They look into it and they put it together. And that's where they start. Because it doesn't take 100 people to do an investigative story. It just takes 1 or 2. But they have to be dedicated to following that story through. And they also have to think through what they're doing before they do it and be able to present it to an editor as something that's going to amount to something. But most of the investigative stories that are written are something that are written alongside a person's daily work effort. It's not something that someone is just told. Actually, I mentioned that. I said, when we were judging, I used the example that I used to students about they didn't tell Don and Jim, you're bright young fellas, take 6 months. And Jim Naughton, who used to work with them, said, 6 months? I'd like to see the series they did in only 6 months. So he was keeping track of their performance in all of that as well. We endlessly see the headlines now of what has been occurring in the economy and the markets. Might business journalists have taken a more active role in uncovering the current financial debacle before it happened? Anybody want to take that one? Yeah, go ahead.
There's no question about that. And all you have to do is go back to Enron. And how many newspapers or magazines prior to Enron's collapse said this company was going to collapse? And it wasn't that the information wasn't there. It was. Like it always is, it wasn't flashing out at people, at reporters, but it was buried in the footnotes of Enron SEC filings and had been buried there for several years on all the entities they had created offshore with the ringing question mark, what is this for? But nobody really pursued it. And the same thing happened with the mortgage debt, the credit swaps. How do you get trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars of credit swaps without any reporter saying, what is this? And what's going to happen? Why are we doing this? Where are they? Who's holding them? What's their worth? And so there's no end. Brian and Robert are just on to, I don't know what they're going to do. They're going to need their own staff of reporters because they have so much good stuff coming that needs to be worked on that if there aren't a dozen other magazines or newspapers out there doing it, somebody is missing a huge opportunity. This has always been true with this business. That's why I started back in the 50s. We have this tendency to pat ourselves in the back and say, we're the saviors of democracy. It doesn't really quite work that way. Because, as I indicated, there was virtually no investigative reporting in the 50s and 60s. It really wasn't until the 1970s that it was created as a beat. You always had to do it on your own time. As Andrew said, the response of most editors was, we'll do this at night and on the weekends. And that works for a while, and after a while you say, I don't think so. That's the end of that. But it wasn't until the 70s that they really created it as a beat in a few papers, a very few papers. And then it's exploded since then. And it really wasn't business journalism back then. But business journalism probably in the last decade, maybe the last 20 years, has really exploded. Investigative journalism in business. But the opportunities are so enormous out there. It's like, what are people doing? Why aren't they out there looking? And part of the problem, quite frankly, is who are you going to write for? This is going to be something that people here are going to have to solve, because this question is going to be answered long after I'm gone. There is no question about the need for the material. The question is, how do you transmit it in a way that there will be a critical mass of readership to respond to it? And I don't know the answer to that.
David, you've won a number of different business journalism awards. Do you, and we know the way you go about things, very meticulous in organizing and putting things together. What could business journalists have done more, even at the local level, that could have led to a higher visibility for the problems that were there?
I think, let me start by talking about in Seattle, we had this .com bubble that swelled up about, back in like 1999, 2000. And so you had companies that were like sort of internet-related companies that grew to enormous size. We had a company in Seattle named InfoSpace. They were essentially an online Yellow Pages. And they never were really profitable. In fact, they were, they were piling up debt. But they became, by early 2000, they were a $31 billion company. They were actually bigger than Boeing Aircraft, which is also based in Seattle. Online Yellow Pages. And a large way that they did this was they convinced, and everybody was doing it, not just them, but this was like part of the industry. They convinced reporters and they convinced the world that there was something called pro forma profits, which essentially was something that wasn't ever approved by accountants, and it was never really something that the SEC recognized, although they did nothing to stop it. It was where they just sort of made up numbers. They said, this is what our profits are, and the pejorative name of it was profits before the bad stuff. So they would take out anything that was going to make it look bad, and they said, well, if you take out all these unusual situations, here's how much profit we made. And as a result, people got invested in this idea of a new economy, and that the rules were different, that everything was different. It violated common sense. And I know that I did a real in-depth look at this company, InfoSpace, and I know that I had to really work against some people in my own newspaper who really still were buying into this concept of pro forma profits, because that was sort of like everybody accepted it. It was like commonly accepted. I think in the most recent financial crisis, there's these loans, these these option arm loans, where what they are is they're loans that bankers make that allow you to pay off a mortgage the same way you would pay a minimum purchase, you pay a minimum balance on a credit card. It doesn't even come close to paying off that credit card. So you're going to be in debt for the rest of your life if you just make the minimum purchase. They were making mortgages on the same principle. So they were giving you a mortgage with a very low teaser rate. It was like, they'd give you a 2% mortgage. And then eventually that mortgage would become a 9% mortgage. And in the meantime, you're paying maybe $1,000 a month on the mortgage, but you're actually, every month you pay, you owe more and more money. So it's actually, the loan is growing rather than shrinking as you're paying it off. It violates common sense. It doesn't make sense. And I think that when we as journalists see things like that, we have to trust our gut on these things and not sort of accept what the industry's telling us, or it just makes sense. Just use your common sense. And I think that those are really good stories.
I think anytime you hear someone say it's a brand new ball game or a new paradigm, it's time to put your hand on your wallet and hold very hard. And there was a time in the dot-com period where rather than profits, they talked about eyeballs. They were gathering eyeballs rather than profits. And it was a whole new paradigm in discussion. The same thing happened with a lot of these complex financial instruments. It's different now. You don't really understand. That's what everyone was always told. We're going to ask one more question here, and then I'm going to open it to questions from the audience. Anita, when young reporters or young journalists are putting together these types of stories, any advice of how they, in thinking multimedia, how do they collect their thoughts? With so many of the things we're discussing here, very complicated, how would you suggest they organize themselves to do it in a multimedia approach?
Well, the key to multimedia, which is what I always say, is it has to be complementary and it has to have many parts. So actually investigative pieces are perfect for this because you have many different parts. They are very in-depth. Think visually. That's easier said than done. People feel like they don't have the resources. You can't do video, that's fine. In the case with Brian's story, that video basically told the story, and that's why you got the hits on it. I mean, that was the wow factor for that story. But you don't always have those kind of resources, or you don't have that kind of image. I'm a big proponent of pull out a few points, make a bullet pointed list if you can't do anything else. Do a timeline. People underestimate timelines. I'm a big fan of timelines. They tell the story. It's particularly what's happening with the economy right now. If you go on a lot of the business sites, both of newspapers and magazines, you'll see interactive timelines. Why? Because the average person reading the newspaper doesn't even know what happened when Fannie Mae crashed or when Merrill Lynch, all that happened that day. Nobody knew. So those timelines help the reader, and our job is to help the reader. So think visually. Multimedia, if I have to say one thing, is journalism, and I hope everyone agrees. It has to have balance, like everything else. You have to show both sides, but it should be complementary with your written piece. Print is as much a part of it as everything else. And so I think use timelines, and I kind of wanted to see what the panel thought about this particular thing. Brian, you said that in your series, the one we're talking about today, that maybe there wasn't so much interactivity or multimedia that could really come from that story. But what about something where you take an interactive timeline and you engage your reader and say, this is how we did the process?
The backstory?
This is the backstory.
Yeah.
And why do we not see more of that? Because readers, they have a lot to say.
I probably left one key component of our multimedia package out, which we do for every story, which is called the Cover Story Podcast.
Okay.
And it's a backstory discussion with one of our top editors and the writers about using questions similar to what Andrew's asked. How did you come up with this idea?
Right.
How did you follow the path? Why did this 0% interest medical credit card seem suspicious to you? Because it was too good to be true, and here's what we found out actually when you dig behind the 0% interest.
Right.
So there are still ways, for sure, and complementarity is key. I mean, one of the things that we find about investigative journalism and the internet is that our website leadership finds investigative journalism to be difficult to sell online because of the length of the story. So statistically, they tell us that if a story has more than one jump online, that only 10% of the people who go to page 1 go to page 2. And we might have 8 pages online. So we have to think of other ways that we can enhance the stickiness of the story, and that's usually through standalone complementary pieces. For example, this is another area where we're still working through it, but most of our stories have original documentation, internal emails, internal memos, legal documents that we really think enhance the credibility of the story because they're what it's based on, and we want to post it. And we're able to do that from time to time. We were able to post, for example, some internal government warnings about cybersecurity attacks that were circulated within the Defense Department that were pretty compelling in saying they know it's bad and it's happening. Because the story you might say, well, is that really true? Well, look, they actually warned each other about it. But that's still not something we do to the level I think we need to.
Out of curiosity, when you post that, did you get reader commentary that in some way actually opens up the story more, or gives you insight into another piece of it?
Well, the documentation that we post isn't the place where we usually get that. It's the story itself. And Robert and I can both tell you that we have gotten probably 5 or 6 new story ideas from the reader comments posted with the story. And I monitor it, several times a day in the immediate period after a story comes out, because inevitably there'll be a tip there.
The web's ability to get feedback is really amazing. Good, bad, or indifferent, viable, not viable, it's still something you should think about when you hear it. When someone makes a comment, as a reporter, I never just dismissed any comment. People say consider the source. Well, often people cannot be the greatest source, but they may be onto something. It's worth knowing. So I'd like to open this now to questions from the audience. If anyone has a question. First over here, Carol over here. Carol Legg is a budding broadcast business journalist, and she's going to be handling our microphone here.
Hi, I'm really struck by David's comments, and that Andrew also echoed, about when people tell you you don't understand, it's the new paradigm. And if you're a general interest old editor like I am, they'll say you're an old fogey. But even more applicable to these students in the room, they'll give the same argument just with different words, saying, well, you're too inexperienced, you're too raw, you're too young to understand what's going on. How do you get past that? It doesn't smell right, but people are just telling you either because you're too old or you're too young, you don't get it.
How do you get past it? I mean, And
for anybody, so you start, but anybody on the panel.
Okay. I'm fortunate in that, in my situation, my editors really trust my gut. So if I go to them with an idea, I don't really have to do a lot of convincing generally to get going on something. And I think but in the cases that I cited, I think it really comes down to it's so common sense. It makes so much sense that if you just can tune it out. I mean, I came from I grew up in Oklahoma, so we went through when was it, in the 80s, I guess, the 70s, the bust that we had an oil boom when they deregulated oil prices, and the market was crazy. The housing was crazy, and then it all just burst suddenly, and you had a big crisis. And so I knew that these things happen, and I was aware of it. And then when I went to Seattle, I got there, and Seattle apparently had never gone through anything like that. I mean, people forgot the last time they'd went through anything like that. So when I got there was all this crazy stuff going on with these internet companies, and you try to tell somebody something, and they'd say, well, yeah, but look, I mean, people are getting rich, people getting rich overnight. They're starting up an internet company, and then 2 months later selling it for $10 million. And how do you argue against that? And it's well, it makes no sense. It makes absolutely no sense. So I think you just trust yourself, trust your judgment on these kind of things.
Are you also saying, in addition to that, in terms of the subject, the person who says that this is a new paradigm, are you saying as a journalist, how do you get beyond that as well?
Okay.
In some ways, that's almost old-fashioned journalism, and that part hasn't really changed at all. It's just the old persistence. And depending on who you are, I mean, some reporters play the aw shucks approach. Others try to be very knowledgeable. I mean, there was a famous story that John Kiffner tells about Homer Biggert, the great New York Times war correspondent back in the 50s and 60s. Biggert was also covering the South during the great civil rights upheavals in the 60s. And at some point, he had to go on vacation. So the New York Times sent young Kiffner down there wet behind the ears. And he's in some county, I think it's Philadelphia, Mississippi, or something like that. And he goes in to see the sheriff. And you correct me if I'm wrong, but we were together and we heard this story. But the sheriff is looking at this young kid briefly, and Kiffner says a couple of things that they're very non-confrontational. And the sheriff says something, well, I think we're going to get along real well because, that Mr. Biggert, all he does is ask a bunch of questions. So, but it's the persistence. I mean, we've found that in dealing with bureaucracies, that when you have a Freedom of Information Act request, or when you want certain information, that's public information, they don't want to give it to you. Sometimes it's just simple persistence. because the average clerk in a government agency likes to keep their desk clean. And if you were standing there or near them or on their phone, they're not keeping their desk clean. And at a certain point, they give in and they give you what you want. So that part, we don't think really changes. It's just persistence, stick with it.
At one of our workshops, we had Bethany McLean from who wrote for Fortune, and she had gotten some of the stories, first ones critical of Enron, and she was talking to the group, and she said, "Well, I'd called them 80 times, and then all the young reporters are like, you called them 80? You're like Bethany McLean from Fortune magazine. You call people 80 times?" And yes, that's that same persistence wherever you're working, whatever you're doing. The same persistence is required to find out things people don't want to tell you.
Jim is absolutely correct with something like this, because this was very true with Enron. There were a lot of quotes in newspapers, unbelievably, that from Enron executives saying, well, people just don't understand this new finance. And I sympathize with what you're saying, but what Jim said is absolutely correct. You just say, well, I personally prefer the dumb approach. Just kind of humor me. I'm really stupid. Let's go through this one step at a time and force people to walk you through it, and don't ever let them stop. I said, well, no, that's still not clear to me. Even if you have to spend a couple of hours, that's what you do. You never walk away without an answer to the question, and after a while it gets interesting.
The reporter's mission of those stories is to keep as quiet as possible, to make that other person uncomfortable, so they will then tell you these stories. And I've been in situations where I've seen other reporters working who are constantly talking to this person they're interviewing.
Right.
That's a real no-no.
This is one of the biggest failings. When we were at Acquire years ago, they used to send us out with other reporters, kind of back up for stories. And you would sit there and listen and say, I didn't come to hear the reporter talk. I want to hear you talk. And this is just Jim indicated, it is a huge failing. Keep your mouth shut if you're a reporter. Just, if the first word out of the mouth isn't who, what, when, where, why, or how, you're doing something wrong.
Let me just add one thing. I come to journalism from a bit of a different background. I spent 10 years inside 2 major corporations. So I can tell you for a fact that when they devised the option arm that David outlined, and they decided that we're going to market this as a financial innovation, they did that because they knew the option arm didn't make any sense. So when a journalist has an instinct that this doesn't make sense, go with it, because I can tell you I've been in the room when the strategy to describe something that doesn't make sense as something good was put together. And I think you really have to stick to your guns. And my favorite is when a company says, we don't comment on rumor and speculation. I can tell you that they are commenting on rumor and speculation the minute the phone hung up, because I've been in the discussion about the rumor and the speculation. So next not taking no for an answer is also a key strategy.
Next question over here. Yes.
Just to kind of follow up on that a little bit, can you talk about the impact of the buyouts and the layoffs in newsrooms on this type of investigative reporting? I can remember at the Charlotte Observer when I was a young reporter, or even later at the Washington Post, being able to go to senior reporters as I was trying to figure out a story or something that was an investigative piece, and being able to sit down with them, or editors who had been around for 20 years. And with what's happening now, some of those people are being moved out of the newsrooms because they have high salaries, they're taking a buyout, they're losing their jobs. So how can we bridge that gulf between the younger ones who are coming in and not having those mid-level to senior reporters and editors around to help?
Well, excellent question, and I think to think also in terms of business investigative journalism. I mean, it is part of the whole package of what's happening in the newsroom. So there's this general squeezing, that there isn't any part of the newspaper being squeezed. General investigative reporting as well. the same thing is happening. It is a constriction. And the loss of some experienced hands is always going to be a problem, always. But again, there's an awful lot of young talent coming up in this business. I've heard some people say that a lot of young journalists, they don't have the values of old journalists and this and that and the other. When I've been out around the country and visited people or been in journalism schools or been in seminars, I don't see that. I see an awful lot of talented people out there who are young, who are committed, who are facing, in some cases, more difficult obstacles than we faced. And things were never easy back then. I mean, they really weren't in journalism. It's just, journalism is a calling. If you respond to it, you love it, you go with it, and you face those.
Actually, the purpose behind starting a business journalism specialization here at the undergraduate and graduate level is that you can have young people right out of the box who can go after these things and do great things. And I'd like to think I got smarter and smarter and smarter every year. Didn't exactly work that way. Certainly experience counts for a lot, but youthful vigor, when you understand something you're writing about, is really a powerful, powerful force.
I got one quick story I've got to tell you. Sure. I don't think I've ever told you this. When I was a cub reporter in Kansas City, when I was going through college, the Kansas City Times would hire you without a degree at that time and train you, basically. I was doing obituaries and rinky-dink car accidents, nothing particularly significant. Every once in a while I'd get something good to do. But I remember turning on one story, a very small story, and the copy editor on the desk, he edited it, and it came back to me, and he said, there's a couple things wrong. But then he leaned over to me and he said, Jimmy, get out while you can. That was one of those times I did not listen to my elders.
The year I graduated from journalism school, I got a letter. You know, you send out 1 million resumes and letters, and I got a letter from a small paper in Florida from the editor. And I thought, oh, this is great, a letter from an editor. And it said, Dear Andrew, the coming year promises to be a bleak one for the newspaper industry. Newspaper shortages and economic downturn means we are unlikely to be adding any new reporters. If we do, it will certainly be one with greater experience than you possess. And then his final word of encouragement was, good luck in your quest. As if I was Don Quixote running toward. And I used to keep that over my desk for a long time because I think that sort of encouragement has been rampant for many years. And I think a lot of people have given that. And I laugh now at some of the people and the things they said to me when I started out that I'm surprised I didn't, go into the suicide ward immediately. But I think it's always been rough in the media and journalism because if it was so easy to do, everybody'd do it. And I think the people who hang in there and do it make a difference. And these people are wonderful examples of it. I think in keeping with my pocket watch here, I think now's the time we will. Sorry we didn't get more questions in, but it's so great. There was so much interaction among the panel. All of these people here have really accomplished a lot, and it's just an honor to even be up here with them today. And now we're going to give the presentation by Don Barlett and Jim Steele of our second annual Reynolds Center Barlett and Steele Awards for Investigative Business Journalism. And as we call each one, we're going to get a quick photo here. If everyone would, and the first one is first place for the BusinessWeek series, Prisoners of Debt, with David Berner and Brian Grow accepting. So, gentlemen, the presentation, please. Here's the
Excellent. Congratulations, fellas. Really excellent work.
Thanks, Jim.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Don.
That was an outstanding series that delved into every aspect of credit problems that every American could run into. So thank you. And then we're going to give our runner-up goes to the Seattle Times for the series The Favor Factory. David is putting a down payment on a large seagoing vessel currently outside his office with his winnings this year. For The Favor Factory, David Heath accepting. And we have before us journalists who really told us something we didn't know. But more importantly, we look forward to the coming generation of Cronkite School and other graduates who will do the same, because this is just, the start, not the end of anything. We look forward to those who will continue on doing great things. Thank you.